I think that I'm starting to realize that fear isn't really 100% bad. I think it's kind of interesting emotion or reaction, whatever you want to call it, because I think it one tells you like, okay, whatever you're afraid about, you obviously care enough about. Because if you didn't care about it, you probably wouldn't be afraid.
Mm-hmm.
Two, I think it kind of like heightens your awareness of certain things. Like if you know of your fear, you kind of looking around all over the place. I mean, okay, I can notice a lot more. One about my environment, but also how I feel inside as well. And then once you're able to name it, identify it, acknowledge it, you can start to move on with it.
Disinformation is spreading.
There will be a surprise outbreak.
We only have so many
the issue of pandemic.
No social distancing at all.
They said that they would express their concerns about the mask supply.
Where's the mask? Where's the glove?
One expert says a second
get away from all of these
We all
people.
need some good news.
A message for all the healthcare workers out there.
Thank you.
If you're looking for hope tonight, raise your hand. If you feel alone and don't understand, if you're fighting the fight of your life, then stand. We're gonna make it through this.
From Santa Rosa, California, this is 19 Stories. I'm Cheryl Halling. My guest, Walter Gaynor II, has a diverse background in digital marketing, IT, and project management. In 2018, Walter founded Bosslocks Media, where, among other endeavors, he produces and hosts the Bosslocks podcast, Bosslocks Journal, Buy Black Friday, where he encourages people to buy from Black-owned businesses and entrepreneurs, and weekly clubhouse forums on working while Black. Bosslocks Media aims to educate, empower, and create opportunities for Black people to access resources and grow in their journey. Their mission is to raise the bar for racial equity and the way people are respected in professional environments. I'm delighted to have Walter Gaynor join me today on 19 Stories.
Oh, what an amazing intro. Thank you.
You're very welcome, where you're doing some pretty amazing things, and I am really happy that you're here with me today. And whereabouts are you joining us from today?
Yeah, located here in Atlanta, Georgia.
And welcome from Atlanta. I have had a guest or two from Atlanta, and through the course of this past year, which of course in the middle of, I don't call it just the COVID pandemic, there's been really important things happening this past year. So if you would take a moment and bring us up to date on your state's current shelter-in-place directives and how, I understand your state is receiving extremely limited supply of COVID vaccines, and maybe you can speak to that for a moment.
It's really interesting in Georgia because I believe where the phase we're in isn't really a reality. I think that since the beginning of the pandemic, Georgia and Atlanta in particular has just been all the way open. People are going out and about. Masks were really, really optional, and people would question you if you had a mask. But I think that now I'm starting to see people take it a little bit more seriously. I know there's a lot of different conversations about the vaccine itself, in addition to its availability, but whether or not we really want to take it. I think a lot of people are leaning on the sides of taking it, but still just kind of questioning its validity of it. Just really knowing, one, does it work? What are the long-term side effects? Because they report that you can get sick from it, but we're wondering like what's going to happen a year from now. So I think everyone's still just waiting to kind of see what's happening next.
That's really understandable considering there are 3 vaccines now, and we're also getting reports of what's going on with the vaccine that was developed in England, and it's kind of 2 sides of the coin. Do you go with the flow and do what you feel is best to protect yourself and those around you, or do you wait and see? And that's a huge question, and certainly other concerns for people of color in the Black community because of things that have happened in the past, and that's understandable. And yet, hopefully, there'll be enough information that we can all delve into to educate ourselves to make the best decisions for ourselves and our families and our community. So I'm curious how, if at all, the directives have affected your business. I find it interesting that you kind of affirmed what other guests from Atlanta, Georgia area have said, that the shelter-in-place directives haven't really been adhered to. But now that so many things are opening up around the country, that there's actually, more adherence to wearing a mask and social distancing. At least that's what I think I'm hearing you say, for the
Yeah.
people in your community. Is that correct?
So 100% correct. I know just like a few people I can think of in my circle, like last year around this time, people were like, man, just come over. It's all good. And now they're like, oh, yeah, I got the double mask on, the Clorox wipes for in and out of the grocery store. So, yes, people are taking it a bit more seriously, especially as they're making plans. Because, of course, we have to adhere to these policies and stay safe. But at the same time, life is continuing to progress. And I think part of like the biggest issue that Atlanta experiences that for a lot of people here, one, a lot of people still have to work. So quarantining wasn't much of an option. And in addition to that, there are a lot of small businesses here. And yes, there were the PPP loans that went out, but still, people still need to go out and bring money home so they could pay their bills and eat. So I think now that there's more, like the vaccines are getting pushed out a bit more, people are feeling a bit more comfortable with going out and about, but they are still paying attention to the different protocols that are in place.
Certainly, because communities of color have been affected differently and more adversely than other
That's
communities.
right. That's
And so
right.
there's a different awareness, different consciousness, if you will.
You kind of reminded me last year I wrote a piece, not exactly what it's titled, but it was for the Inclusion Solution, which really does a really great job at highlighting the issues and also providing solutions to a lot of race related issues in the workplace, diversity and inclusion. But I wrote a piece for their blog that basically was looking at COVID and saying, all right, has COVID done more harm than racism? And the answer is not really. It's really exposed a lot of the effects of racism, how a lot of Black people are affected at a higher rate because of the living conditions they're forced in. Factories are built around Black neighborhoods, which cause health problems long term. So that's some of the immediate things. I think COVID has done a great job at exposing the systems in place that affect Black people and people of color differently than others. And kind of what you're speaking to earlier about just the vaccine, like I know me myself, when I first heard about it, I was like, are you serious? That sounds crazy. Like, you want us to take it? Something that's brand new, especially with the history of medicine and Black people from like the Tuskegee experiments and all these different, I think the disrespect that a lot of people have had for Black people over the years. So, yeah, it's a really interesting period of time. And I think we all have a choice we have to make, and there's really no right answer as to how we want to move forward.
That's because we all have different perspectives, right? And they affect our reality and what we've lived into up until this point. And I want to talk to you about what your inspiration was for forming Boss Lux Media and the Boss Lux podcast.
Good question. It's kind of interesting because this really has been a whole journey. I launched the podcast last year in May in the midst of this pandemic, and I think the pandemic actually provided me the clarity to go ahead and launch it. But this all started from my lock journey. I started my lock journey in 2007, the summer. Really an impromptu decision. Just I was at a friend's house, and I think I was in seventh grade. And his dad came home and was like, hey, you want to try locks? And I was like, all right, yeah, let's do it. It's really just a whim. And like my whole life growing up, I always got a lot of compliments with it. But when I was getting ready to graduate from college, all these compliments and conversations about like, oh, it's amazing started to turn into, all right, so now you get ready to graduate. You've done great in school. You probably do great in the workforce, but you're going to have to cut your hair if you want to actually get a job, get a good job at least. And I really remember like all of these conversations because each time I heard them, I was like, are you serious? Like for real? And the more that we spoke about it, I started to realize, you know what, I actually understand because there currently, especially that year, there was a ruling in court that basically said that companies can discriminate based on someone's hair, basically saying that the hiring manager decided, like, you know what, your hairstyle doesn't fit our company culture. That wasn't discriminatory.
Was not familiar with it. And I'm just want to back up. We're talking about hair here.
Yeah, so I have locks which are commonly referred to as dreadlocks. A lot of people with them don't call them dreadlocks, but I never kind of push back on this or that because I used to call them dreadlocks. Yes, dreadlocks, locks, and natural hair, black natural hair, has an interesting history in both the workplace, but also just the U.S. history. Like dating back to like colonial times, like there was actually a law placed that made women cover their hair if it was natural, and also to cover it just to symbolize their status, like freed slave or still a slave. So there's been a history of black people, black hair, and I guess authority for centuries and it's passed down to generations. Could go super deep into that, but yes, in 2016 there was a case that was submitted to the circuit court, the U.S. Circuit Court, where a woman had the opportunity to work at a company, but the company was like, all right, if you want to work here, you just have to cut your locks. And she was like, no, that's not happening. But they took it to court, and one would think that the court would be like, yeah, Mr. Company people, you can't do that. But they deemed that hair is not a part of the Civil Rights Act. So it doesn't symbolize your character, your race, or anything like that. So companies had the right to make hiring decisions based on hair.
And yet it is very much a part of who we are. We're born with the hair that we're born with. It is our identity in many ways. And yet that's insane. I wasn't familiar with that particular ruling. And I can't imagine being someone who's qualified for a position, and yet I'm told I can't do it because of my hair. And yet I'm not surprised by it. One of the reasons I'm really grateful that you're joining me is because maybe I'll preface it by saying, I recently listened to your Boss Locks podcast, episode 30, entitled I See Color, where you played a message from an 80-year-old Caucasian woman by the name of Jill, who called in coincidentally from California, which is where I live. And her question was, what is the appropriate place for me in this discussion or platform? And I found your answer really interesting in that your podcast is open for all, and you do curate private spaces exclusively for Black people to have tough conversations with each other without white people in order for the conversation to flow freely. And on that same episode, you issued a challenge to listen to and find an episode to share and talk about why we're sharing that episode and ask people to listen to it. One of the reasons I wanted to have you here is I'm choosing to use this platform right now to do so, as I feel it's an important episode for people outside of the Black or Brown community to listen to and do a bit of personal introspection of how we are or are not taking the time to understand the people of color in our own lives and communities. And so my question to you, though, Walter, is I'm curious if you see the value in having regular open discussions that can foster understanding and resolution where we can all be able to be at the table together, transparent with one another, tough conversations and all. And as you emphasize, to listen and be heard.
That's a very good question. And yes, part of the reason I recorded that episode was because my podcast, I only feature Black people on the podcast for a very particular reason. But I think these conversations are basically the starting point to discussions that have to be had by everyone, whether it's people speaking or listening, all the above. I'm really strongly believe that it is not on one culture or one race's shoulders to bring about this equitable world that we all want to live in. Because and like I've had a lot of people in my life from all cultures, so and I've walked in all of these different environments, so I know it's definitely possible. Now, the reason why I only feature Black people on the podcast is because back to when I was getting ready to graduate, I was actually challenged by a friend of mine because it was a friend who recommended that I cut my locks. And he challenged me to name one well-known CEO who had not started from entertainment, but was like, well known. Like, I think by that time I was watching a lot of Shark Tank. I love that show. And I always look up to like Mark Cuban and like all those people. I was like, yeah, I'm gonna be a shark on Shark Tank one day. So like he challenged me. And really the only people I can name were Damon John and Oprah. Damon John's the founder of Fubu. Oprah is the one and only Oprah. And that was a problem because one, they didn't have locks, but two, I could only name two. Black CEOs. I could name Gary Vee, Mark Cuban. I could go down the list forever to talk about all these like amazing leaders. And it's like, okay, that's a problem. So I started to Google, and I still couldn't come up with anyone. So I realized like, okay, so one, I don't actually know if I could get a job with locks while keeping my hair, but I know that I would do wonderful in the working environment with my locks. Two, I couldn't name any Black leaders to look up to. So I literally just was like, all right, so maybe I'll just put together a little blog and start highlighting Black leaders. But in addition to that, I was like, all right, I need to figure out how to get this job. So I started to just reach out to people I knew who were like literally three people. One was an entrepreneur who had locks, and his recommendation was like, hey, well, if you start your own business, you could do whatever you want. No one could tell you what to do. So that was great, but I was like, all right, I'm just getting out of college. I got student debts coming up. I want to get a job real quick so I can start paying those. The next person I spoke to, she was in banking, and she had locks, but one, she didn't actually go by her first name, because another thing that Black people experience in the workplace is that they face discrimination based on their name. And that's a whole other topic to go into. But oftentimes in hiring decisions, or even if you get hired in the workplace, you'll face different types of treatment if people find your name difficult for them to pronounce. So she went by her middle name and also kept her hair wrapped all the time, never let it show. So the third person I spoke to, she went by her first name. Her locks, she always wore them out. She was unapologetic, always herself. And she actually was the very first person I interviewed or featured on the Boss Look podcast. That's Trishana McDaniel. And basically, I started to realize that these conversations need to be heard by everyone. So I went all in on this podcast and decided to feature Black leaders with natural hair, because at that time I didn't know of any at all. So I was like, each time I speak to someone, I want to showcase them. I basically want to be that Joe Rogan podcast where he has all these different experts from all over the world, but they're all Black, because it's important for Black people to coming up to see leaders, see people who look like themselves. Mm-hmm. So yes, that's why I only feature Black people. But to go back to your original question about these conversations, if they need to be had by all, yes, I completely agree.
Just to be clear, and forgive me if it sounded like that, I'm certainly not asking you to justify why you have a podcast that is directly targeted towards your community and members of your community. I was just more asking the question of taking it further with whether it's through my podcast or your podcast, a bonus episode of having more forums where, as you touched upon earlier, where we can all come together, because it isn't on one side. It is incumbent upon one community to address some really deep-rooted issues in our country. And I've listened to your interview with Janae Anderson on the power of words. Your episode, I think it's 28 with Mac, and is it Alonge of the Equal Group?
Yeah, Mac Alonge.
Alonge. Thank you for correcting me on that. And on the Buy Black Friday, which was wonderful because I didn't know, this is a tool that's used by a lot of podcasters in scheduling, is the Calendly business.
Oh, yes. Yeah, that was an interesting one. It's an amazing tool I started using as well. I had no idea it was Black owned, but it's really incredible what he was able to do, reaching a $3 billion valuation, a valuation higher than Clubhouse. And that was valuated at the same time as Clubhouse as well, or at least announced at the same time. So yes, that was a really big win, because I think that will have a trickle effect or a ripple effect on other Black startups.
Which is wonderful, because, I mean, I hate to say it this way because it's true. Like, okay, if someone does something that the powers that be, whether it's entertainment, because we see this a lot in Hollywood, no one's going to make a multi-million-dollar successful film by a handheld camera. And then you have the Blair Witch Project, and everybody wants to do the next Blair Witch Project. And now you have a company, which I did not know it was a Black-owned business, and it wasn't a consideration in that I will or will not be a patron based on that, other than, is it a good business? That's the main thing that should happen. Is it a good business? And secondly, oh, wow, it's owned by a person of color. How can we support that? And now you're probably going to see more investment in, and rightfully so, and hopefully it'll be a good thing. Well, there'll be more people wanting to invest in Black-owned business owners, because they, meaning whoever is the financier, sees that they can be successful businesses too. And why that's a surprise is it shouldn't be. I just thought it was a really good episode because I'm sitting here writing down, I'm like, no grease. I was like, okay, well, that's, I can't frequent that business because first of all, for a lot of reasons, but it was it was very interesting to be exposed to those businesses. And I just think what you're doing is really a service, obviously not just to your community, but hopefully in educating on a broader level. And so I'm hoping, I don't know how, but maybe this is the first of many conversations where we can go deeper and have tougher conversations and bigger conversations. So I'm curious, during this past year with COVID, if you have found yourself up against fear and what skill sets you've learned to help you combat it.
Yes, I definitely have. So, I think, I don't know if I mentioned that, but 2016 is when I graduated. And that's also the same year I started basically looking into like, okay, are there black leaders out there? And also, how can I get a job? And I'm mentioning that year in particular because I started this in 2016 and then I started putting more energy into like, okay, yes, I'm going to do this in 2017, but didn't launch it till 2020 for a number of reasons. But
Oh,
the
wow.
biggest one was fear. It is so crazy. So I think one thing that this podcast has gifted me is an opportunity to, I don't want to use overcome because I think it's still in process, but basically to confront that fear, looking in the eyes and be like, okay, what are you? Like, can I name you? Do I understand you? Why am I experiencing this? And is it that's terrifying? Like, going on YouTube, for example, taking these episodes and putting on YouTube so people could see me. That was terrifying. Recording the trailer, that was terrifying as well. And to be honest, I'm still really uncovering why exactly I feel fear, but I think that for most of my life, I've experienced something called imposter syndrome, which is something I'm just learning
Oh,
about. And
oh, it's real. It's
yeah,
real,
it is
Walter.
so real. So real. In fact, I first learned about it from an interview on The Breakfast Club, which is this popular radio show, Black culture. But they were interviewing an artist named Wale, and he was talking about it. And I was like, hold on, what you're explaining sounds exactly like what I'm going through. So, yes, imposter syndrome has been a huge impact on my life. It's something I'm currently understanding and learning to grow with as well. It was kind of interesting. But yes, definitely had to overcome fear, learn what this fear really means, and also I guess embrace it a bit as well. Because I think that I'm starting to realize that fear isn't really 100% bad. You know, I think it's kind of interesting emotion or reaction, whatever you want to call it, because I think it one tells you like, okay, whatever you're afraid about, you obviously care enough about, because if you didn't care about it, you probably wouldn't be afraid.
Mm-hmm.
Two, I think it kind of like heightens your awareness of certain things. Like if you know of your fear, you kind of looking around all over the place. I mean, okay, I can notice a lot more, one about my environment, but also how I feel inside as well. And then once you're able to name it, identify it, acknowledge it, you can start to move on with it. Like kind of put your arm around and be like, hey, you know, it's not that bad. So, yeah.
Imposter syndrome, I think, has a lot to do with, the pressures of social media, of how we're supposed to show up. And are we our authentic selves? Because there's all the beautiful pictures and, everybody can paint whatever life they want to online. And yet, the more we face our fears, and especially I completely get it because you and I met actually through a recent online podcast conference called Podfest. And, in listening to some of these successful stories, I'm like, okay, I'll just sit over here with my 1,200 downloads when everyone's talking about 50,000 downloads or whatever they're talking about, the success of their
Right.
podcasts. And you're thinking, am I an imposter here? What am I doing in these circles? And yet, to be fair, I mean, anyone listening who might be listening from Podfest, it was a very authentic, real, and open online conference that really gave a lot of information, really good information, some that I may not have agreed with or resonated with me, but it was a really nice forum to connect with other podcasters who are up against the same things. And I think imposter syndrome is one of them, but I definitely hearing what you're saying about how it relates to you. And certainly you had touched upon that. I read where you've already kind of spoke to this about when you graduated and, some of the anxieties you were having about not having a strong enough resume to land an entry level job, and then also stressed about your locks. And then, as you shared, your search on Google to find Black leaders with locks, et cetera. So part of that can be fair to say because you didn't see the leaders, you didn't see people out there like yourself who were in positions of power.
I think that'd be a fair thing to say. Not only that, I think a lot of things in life we don't even know stems from childhood, but there's just so many things that you just witness growing up, and it does have a long term effect on you. So I think I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, which is it's an interesting city. It's a beautiful place to go visit, tour. Everything here about Charleston is wonderful. I definitely enjoyed living there. But one thing from just the Black perspective is when you're actually living there, it's not segregated, but there definitely is like an unspoken way of life. And you'll notice that there are Black people in one part of the city, people from the Latinx community in another part, white people in another part, so on, so on. So when you are just grow up and you see the people in the higher places don't look like you, it does something to you. I think part of why I love living in Atlanta is, and part of the reason I moved to Atlanta was because it was the first time I saw Black people everywhere in all stages of life, high up in powerful places, just living their best life. And that was something that was new to me. So there are a lot of different factors in life that sometimes seem insignificant, but play a huge role in your perspective, both on life and yourself as well, and where you fit in society.
Definitely. And I had lived in the South for 2 years. I lived in Tennessee, and there's some beautiful people there, definitely. And yet the history of what the South represents, and it's very deep rooted. Even as a Caucasian coming from California, I felt the energy there that we do not have here because we don't have that history. I mean, not saying that
It's definitely a different type of history, though. Yeah, you're right.
yeah, it's a different history. I'm certainly not saying that racism doesn't exist in California because it does. I'm saying what I felt in living in the South, and it's kind of a palpable energy. And even moving about different parts of, we lived in Nashville proper, but you go outside of the city and you feel different things. You kind of know when you're in an area that maybe you don't belong in simply because you're not from around there. I think it's different. We lived there 11 years ago, but coming from California, it was a new thing when a lot of Californians were coming in and changing the culture, and people love to be set in their ways, so to speak, but certainly has changed, like I say, in the past 11 years, but in some very small way, I resonate with that. But how wonderful that you found your Mecca, so to speak,
Yeah.
in
Yeah, it's
Atlanta.
wonderful living here. It's really interesting. One thing I ask people at the beginning of each episode. I started with episode 31 doing this, but I started to ask people, how do you identify? I think for most people, and this isn't just white people, it's Black people as well, there's an expected way that you should live life. It's like a mainstream way to be Black. But one thing that Drasana McDaniel, who was in the first episode of Boss Lock, she lived in Atlanta, and she basically observed that there are so many different ways to be a Black person. She kind of coined the term 8,000 ways to be Black. So kind of that definitely was inspired by Atlanta, just seeing not only, yes, yeah, being the Black Mecca, but also like, okay, you could be this type of Black, that type of Black. You could be exactly who you want to be, and there's a space for you here. So, yes, Atlanta is definitely an interesting city. I'd recommend everyone at least visit just to witness. And the food's awesome too, so you can't go wrong.
Hey, there's some really good food in the South.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and the argument between the Georgia peach and the Tennessee peach, it's the struggle's real. It's like what I understand. I understand that the Georgia peach reigns, but I would love to visit Atlanta at some point. I do have some friends there, and there's some VO conferences that happen there every year, and certainly a place I would like to go. Probably not in the thick of summer. Can't deal
Oh,
with the humidity.
yeah, me neither.
Sorry, just sorry. I'm curious if you have a particular faith that you rely on.
That's an interesting question as well, because I don't have a yes or no answer to that. I grew up, I think everything I do is kind of spiritual in a way. So I think I grew up with kind of like a Christian based learning, but also have a grandfather who's experienced a lot of different walks of life, and he's very Christian as well. So definitely grew up having that, I guess, mindset, but I wasn't in church every Sunday. Matter of fact, for a period of time, I went to this church called Unity, which most people haven't heard of it, but it's basically like a metaphysical version of Christianity. It's based on Christianity, but very spiritual based. So I grew up learning about things like the law of attraction, just being like what you put out into the world is what you receive, what you focus on, you're going to get more of that. And that I think has definitely shaped all of my life. So like, it's interesting faith. That's an interesting question because I think growing up, every single member of my family has had a different. They each have different walks of life that they pick, but everyone has always spoken about the law of attraction and things relating to that. And I think that's part of why Muhammad Ali was a really big icon in my family because not only is he a great boxer, but basically what he represented. Like he would go on there and just boldly say, "I am the greatest." And that's like a perfect example of law of attraction. Like sometimes it doesn't even matter if you are the greatest, but really just believing that and being able to say it out loud could attract that back towards you. But with that being said, as I grow older, I think that I've basically reconsidered, I guess, my position, my stance, my perspective on God and kind of the impact on life. It's kind of interesting. I think I'm still on that journey now, just to really discover like how would I define my faith? Because I don't think I have a traditional sense or a traditional answer as to what my faith is. But I think it, whatever it is, it definitely has a very big impact on my life, my outlook, my optimism, and just how I think approach relationships.
And I think it is a lifelong journey, isn't it?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, it is.
it's so interesting the answers I get when I ask that because I'm not looking for a correct or accepted answer. I'm just looking for what people rely on, especially this past year and encompassing our whole lives and in the challenges that we go through and the things that we face and what do we rely on for our strength? Because you were speaking to Muhammad Ali and, him declaring I am the greatest, well, that's certainly going to help combat the imposter syndrome. If you can, right, is, to make declarative statements of this is who I am and believing it, even if that's not what your circumstances say. And I think, even starting a podcast, starting your YouTube channel, is I am a podcaster. I am a podcast producer. I am on YouTube. And that can, as you said, can be terrifying. And I know before I launched my podcast, I was terrified. What if I say the wrong thing? Okay, well, you learn from it and hopefully you move on. What if I ask bonehead questions? Which I'm, hopefully I haven't done so far, but, you learn from that as well and hopefully don't do any damage along the way. But yeah, the whole idea of affirming who you are and however you relate to God, I think that's really emulating God because God wants us, if I can just preach for a quick moment, wants us to declare our victories over our circumstances, living into our higher calling and the best that we can be. And I think to me, that's one of the highest forms of spirituality. But you didn't ask me that question. I asked you.
Oh, but I'm glad you shared. I'm glad you shared. I think I definitely agree with that. You also kind of reminded me. So my grandfather is definitely a very big presence in my life, and my entire life, he's two things that he always does ever since I was younger, and I always love it. One, we'll just be talking, and he'll just automatically just be like, "Go look up this passage," and I never forget exactly what passage it is from the Bible after the conversation, but he'll explain it to me while we speak, and it always like some lesson from the Bible always applies to what I'm going through right now. So that's always stuck with me. And the other thing he would always do, and he's done it with my whole family as well. It's just like well, we're talking about something and a word may come up and it's like, what does that mean? Do you know what it means? And I was like, I mean, it means this, but like, is that the definition? I'm like, oh, it's like, go look it up. And so I think just understanding or with that mindset to always look at definitions that has one, allowed me to look at words differently, look at how they're used. And I think also has definitely shaped what the podcast is or what it stands on. Because in addition to faith, something that he always talks about is really knowing yourself and knowing you're the only you is. That's something I stick to when I think about imposter syndrome, in addition to faith, but really just honing in on the fact that I am, even if I try to be like someone else, I'm going to be different because I am unique. It's like there's no one person who is exactly alike. So I think those two things definitely help shape what the podcast is, but also who I am developing into and who I try to help other people develop into as well. But that's a whole other story.
That's beautiful, Walter, because you, in your quest, in your journey to find the answers as it relates to your experience, you were tapped on the shoulder to do the podcast that you're doing. You were tapped on the shoulder to do Boss Locks Media. Nobody else has done it before in the way that you're doing it. And in some bizarre way, that's one of the reasons we have the experiences that we do, hopefully, is to guide us into what are we supposed to do with these experiences? Do we have a platform? Do we have a voice that can maybe speak into other people's lives and help them on their journey and quest to be their authentic self? Certainly what I'm getting with the platform that you've created for yourself. And so I'm curious, along your way from your graduation, and you graduated with a BA in business administration, and I understand you're bilingual, you speak Spanish. Along the way in getting to where you're at now, has there been a time when you've experienced a really big fail that on the other side of that kind of informed you of keeping in the direction you're going, or maybe even switching to a new direction?
That's a good question. You had some really good questions, by the way. I just want to say that.
Well,
That's
thank you.
interesting. Well, I'll say I learned a lot. One thing I used to ask people on the podcast are what are some of your biggest wins this year and lessons learned? Because I think one thing my mom instilled in me in an early young age is like it's a failure if you didn't learn something, but if you learn something, it's a lesson. So I'll say I've learned a lot from this podcasting journey. I think the biggest thing, which I have to continue to remind myself of, is that you can try to do all these different things to make what you're working on really like blow up and really succeed, but none of it really matters. Like it just, I think consistency is really the biggest part. Just continue to do what you do, even if it's simple, even if it's minimalistic. Just I think just the act of continuing to put something out on a regular basis, continue to show up for the community that you're building and just check in. I think that's the biggest thing. So I've definitely spent hours and hours looking into all these different tools and techniques that at the end of the day don't really matter, not as much as
Showing
releasing
up.
episodes. Yeah, showing up. So yeah, I think that's one of the biggest lessons. Yeah, I could probably go on and on about all the different lessons or failures, but I think that maybe I didn't really expect is just how well this journey would go. Because I think even with the mistakes of losing an episode, which that has happened, or just having some really terrible sound quality, I think that on some episodes, I think that it's all really a journey. And fortunately, I'm speaking to someone who listens to the podcast, and they're like, "Yeah, I mean, the episodes now sound way better than at the beginning." But it's kind of cool just to see that progression. So I think that I'm glad that I've always been authentic and was honest about where I am on this journey.
And I think beyond sound quality, because I know with the recording platform I'm using, I get dropouts once in a while. And I think the content, granted, people love good sound quality. I'm not saying that they don't, but if the content is, that's the most important thing. You can have the best sounding podcast in the world, but if the content isn't there, and if there isn't a message, or if there isn't something people can take away, then at least for me and my understanding, then what's the point of doing it? Are you saying something that's worthwhile? And you touched on consistency, and that's so interesting because literally this morning I was reading about consistency. And like you say, sometimes it's just the really small baby steps that we take every single day of just showing up and showing up and showing up and being present and allowing the lessons to unfold. And that's good wisdom from your mother. How do you take care of yourself in the midst of all your responsibilities and insanity going on right now?
You know, what's funny is I just kind of preach about consistency, but I think the past 2 months I have been more intentional about taking care of myself because you can't be consistent if you're not there. So I think that I've actually I stopped putting a few episodes out, and that definitely goes against the plan, the strategy. But I think sometimes we forget that it's because we have such just like productivity mindset. We're like, okay, we always have to produce, produce, produce. But sometimes like your body's just like, you know what? It's not time right now. You just got to take care of some other things, and that just life just throws at you, or maybe just you take a break and rest. So I had been intentional about doing nothing, and that sounds crazy, but I think that's something that I experience, and probably a lot of Black people, people of color experiences this whole something I would describe as workaholic mentality. And so one thing that a lot of people, Black people, and I'm sure other people of color, experiences that when it comes to showing up not only in class but also in the working world, it's like, yeah, you have to do better than the average. You got to be top of the top of the top because oftentimes people don't expect you to be able to do anything at all or succeed or do this well. Or if you do something average, it's not going to be looked at the same as people from other cultures doing something averagely. So I think that mindset, while it's a great solution to do well at work, it's not that great for your just your mental wellness. And I think you take that into other aspects of life as well. So something I'm intentionally doing is taking breaks and relaxing, spending days where I might go all in on some content creation or research, but just going to the park or something like that, spending time with people. So yeah, I think that one thing that a lot of creatives don't do enough of is just saying it's okay if I don't do
Do
anything
anything.
today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. And you touched on showing up every day. We talked about that, but part of showing up is taking care of yourself in sometimes, like what you just said, doing nothing. I've had a couple of guests that equate it to putting on your oxygen mask when you're on a plane. And if you don't replenish your well, there's not much to give. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just be in the moment. And like you say, go to the park and just sit on a bench and look at a tree,
Right.
and really be one with the very things that fill our soul and replenish us so that we can show up. So it's good. I know I listened to one of your podcasts where you were saying that you had a nice backlog of episodes and that you were going to take a break so that you can edit them and also just take some downtime. It's interesting how we feel that we need to have permission to do that. And yet that is part of the creative process. So kudos to you for honoring yourself and doing that. And so with that, with taking some time out, what brings you joy?
That's a good question as well. I'm not gonna lie, Netflix definitely brings me joy. Yeah, I call myself a Hulu connoisseur, so yeah, that definitely brings me joy.
Any
I
show
think
in particular?
The Office is
Oh,
the best show I think ever created. But yeah, we've been watching a few different shows, but I think also just spending time with loved ones, which is kind of like odd now because of the COVID and everything, but just checking in with people, calling people up. Like I mentioned going to the park. Is literally yesterday. We took our niece to the park, and she's like about to be 2, and she's just running around in the grass picking flowers, like living her best
oh
life.
my
And I was like,
gosh.
man, I was
Yes.
just chilling there. So
Yes.
yeah, yeah. So I always like to enjoy the little things in life. I also recently just moved, which was not a joy at all, but it kind of reminded me to actually do enjoy being a bit more physically active. So, like, I used to play soccer. Like, you could literally, if you didn't know where I was on a soccer field somewhere doing something. So, yeah, I'm looking to get back into doing some more kind of physical type activities, sports, all that good stuff because I really love being active.
Well, hopefully the move is a good thing for you. New beginning,
Oh
new place.
yes, yeah, we leveled up a little bit. Oh, a little bit, not like drastically. If we're not like in the Coming to America mansion or anything like that. But I think I just like this part of the city a bit more than the other part. That's really the biggest piece. But
Certainly not coming to America too. So I
yeah,
started to watch the
not yet.
sequel and I'm like, nah, no, just leave it alone as its standalone film.
Oh yeah, like I think they did. I mean, they did a good job, but definitely doesn't touch the first one at all.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like when someone remakes a song And you're thinking, well, unless you're going to
Yeah.
remake it and take it up a level, just let it be. And some films are,
Just let it be.
some films are worthy of a sequel. Others are just like, let it stand on its own. First
Right.
one
Like,
was
I think
so,
they had fun, which I guess is
yeah,
good.
yeah.
They
Well, that's
definitely enjoyed themselves, but
Is there something you wish folks were mindful of right now as it relates to how we can care for one another?
that's a good question. I think that, a lot of times people debate this or that, whether it's racism, poverty, all these different things. But I think that sometimes we debate based on our own perspective and how we feel. But I think
Mhm.
that this is Black people as well. I think everyone needs to be intentional about taking ourselves out of the situation and really 100% putting ourselves in other people's shoes, because it's really all about understanding. Like, we debate based on our own understanding, but I don't think that we do enough of the learning. I think we talk more than we listen. So I think back to what you mentioned on the episode 30 is my challenge was for everyone to listen, is because it's kind of like human nature to just base everything based on our own understanding, but it's kind of impossible for us to just automatically understand everything. I mean, there's things that I'm still understanding about myself. So it's like impossible for other people just to be like, oh, yeah, I already know everything. I think that when it comes to healing and helping other people heal, I think that we need to listen on a whole another level. That's actively listening, hearing the experiences, and really diving deeper on things we don't understand. Because I think that's another thing. I think that we all feel as though we have to know everything. Like, if we don't know something, then oh my god! But it's okay if you don't know. It just means that you need to find the answers. So I think that when people are a part of conversations, I don't think we have to prove that we're right or defend our stance. I think that we just need to be a bit more active and intentional about listening and learning.
Really good point. There's a reason we were giving 2 ears and 1 mouth. And,
That's
um,
right.
because if we're constantly talking, we're not listening. I think we're at a time because there's so much information out there that we think if we don't know it, we're gonna look stupid or people are gonna think less of us. Well, the only way we can learn is if we ask questions. And you referred to scripture. There's a fantastic one that says, if you ask not, you have not. Unless we ask, unless we delve deep into conversations that maybe we wouldn't have had in the past, but with a new awareness, we can. I'm going to coin a phrase that a friend of mine has for her coaching business: trust and be brave. That even if we ask the wrong questions initially, at least we're asking and trying to understand one another. I appreciate that you're willing to be here and share your heart and share your journey and a little bit of, your vulnerability and why you're doing what you're doing, how you've gotten to this point. And I would love to know what makes you hopeful.
What makes me hopeful? Well, I think that I'm like naturally a optimistic person, to be honest. So I think that's just kind of built in me. But besides my own just like natural optimism, I think that I'm hopeful because I do see the beginnings of what can be changed. And I'm not talking about like all these like new commercials we see where they're featuring black people in movies and things like that. That's great, but it's kind of like bare minimum to me. But I do see other things like we mentioned Calendly, black owned company that reached $1 billion valuation. That's very huge. If you think about it, years ago, there were a lot of black entrepreneurs and businesses that were doing well, but they were literally burned down. And it's so great to see that a business can be built, a black owned business, from the beginning all the way up to the top. So that brings me hope. I think last year with the Black Lives Matter movement, that's not the first time there were public demonstrations for Black Lives Matter, but it was the first time I saw so much support from other cultures. And some of it was very, very trendy, but a lot of it was authentic. So that brings me hope. I think in addition to that, last year, I myself saw people from all cultures from all over the world really coming together to support Black Lives Matter. It's the first time I personally got to really hear and understand the experiences of people from other countries, countries I've never been to. I really barely know anyone from those countries, but I was able to see it and hear it, and we're able to speak to each other about it. That brings me hope. So I think that I'm hopeful because I see the beginnings of the change, and I see people who truly want to bring change. One of the companies I work with, I think they've been doing a great job with having an inclusive environment, but they were very intentional and public about, all right, yeah, we probably aren't there yet, but we're going to step it up a notch. So I think people are at a place now where they're a bit more willing to learn. There are definitely a lot of people who are stuck in their ways, but I don't really focus too much energy on them because I'm not here to change people's minds. I'm just here to share perspectives, opinions, and continue the conversation. It's really exciting to see a lot more people extending their platforms, their opportunities to other people as well. So I think all of those things bring me hope.
And I think you are being the change that you want to see. As you say, trying to change somebody else. Really, the only thing that we can do is change ourselves and how we act and react. And while we're trying to change someone else, it's taking our energy away from doing other good work rather than focusing on the division, prayerfully, with the awareness that we have as a country over this past year, which has been, as you say, it's not the first time. It's been a struggle for 400 years. Certainly my hope and my prayer for you and for our communities worldwide and within the U.S. is that we can make the changes so where these conversations they don't have to be conversations anymore, that people are living into, as you say, living their best lives, no matter who you are, how your hair is, and where you live. And so I'm curious if there's something else you'd like to talk about as it relates to this time in your life.
I'd first like to say thank you for saying that because I think, in addition, just to I guess everything I mentioned, I'm still understanding my own value in this. So it is kind of interesting to hear like from you saying that. Okay, it seems as though you are kind of the change that you're seeking. That's definitely very powerful. So thank you for sharing that. I think that I don't know. I think the only other thing I'd like to share is that I'm really excited for I think what's next, both for my own journey and just what's next for the world. I feel as though we're at I guess the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much more below the surface that other people are taking on, they're experimenting with, and there's still so much that we haven't even seen yet. I feel like
Mhm.
from podcasting to being black publicly. We're kind of I think at this interesting period of time where there's a shift happening. Not to say that one group has more power than the others, but I think a lot of people are really identifying their value, their place in the world, and just understanding that they don't have to follow the path that was laid out for them. I think that there are a lot of black people that are noticing like, okay, you know what? I don't have to go work at that company that doesn't really value me or wants to diminish who I am. And they're starting to build their own communities and ecosystems. Like last year, during the midst of the pandemic, a group of black people came together and bought, I forgot the exact number, but over 90 acres of land in Georgia and are building a community there, an inclusive community. But the fact that it's black families coming together to do that is extremely powerful. And that's part of why I built the Working Well Black community, or where I'm starting to build that, is because not to necessarily be exclusive, but just to bring people together to understand, like, all right, we don't have to go by the standards. We don't have to change ourselves. We could continue to be ourselves and build something beautiful. I think the last thing I just like to share with everyone is I'm excited to see what's next, and also I'm open to having conversations with everyone. Dumb questions, smart questions. I'm open to receiving them all. If I don't have an answer, I'll direct you to someone who does, or we could find the answer together. But yes, I'm really excited about this global community that's being formed.
I am excited for you as well, Walter, and I really appreciate your time and being here with me and sharing your insight. And the last question I have for you is, if there was a soundtrack to your life, what would be on it and why?
Oh, I was not ready for that one.
Boom.
Gotta leave everyone with me fumbling. Okay, so I think it would definitely have J. Cole on it because that's definitely my favorite artist. This is something that a lot of people don't know, but I used to listen to the Foo Fighters a lot. I don't remember the name of the song, but I probably have a song from the Foo Fighters on it. Foo Fighters and Red Hot Chili Peppers. Those were two artists I definitely loved in middle school. And Jay-Z, I think, would probably produce the soundtrack because I'm a big
Oh,
fan
so
of
now we have
Jay-Z.
someone producing your soundtrack.
Oh, yes. We're going big production,
I'm
Cheryl.
sorry, I didn't go deep in that question. So
Yeah,
let me rephrase
yeah.
that. What would be the soundtrack to your life? What would be on it, and who would produce it? So, okay.
Yes, yes. Also, if you want to do like an interlude, you're more than welcome to, Cheryl, because it was an awesome episode, and I think it'd be interesting to have you in there. Like, oh yes, we're taking a break. So yeah,
I would love to.
maybe
I
a whole
mean,
thing.
part of it is the music clearance thing, but yeah, I mean, maybe if I mix all of these together and it's semi-recognizable, I can bypass the rights usage. But how can people get a hold of you? So actually, I lied. This is my last question to you. Please tell us how people can get a hold of you and hear your podcast.
Oh yes. I guess the easiest way is just to go to the website, which is bosslocks.org. That is BOSSLOCKS. And the K is important, one, because if you don't have it in there, you won't find it, but also it stands for knowledge of self. So yeah, BOSSLOCKS. That's us on Instagram. Oh yeah, bosslocks.org, the website. Yeah, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all of that great stuff. Personal one is It's the Great Walt, because I'm trying to embody that Muhammad Ali just statement, I'm the greatest. So you can find me there as well. And yeah, I would say do not hesitate to reach out to say hi, ask any questions. I strongly believe that there's literally no such thing as a dumb question, because if you're asking it, you just don't know, and I'd be happy to answer it. So yes, connect with me. I love to meet new people, and yeah, let's grow together.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And I will have that information in the show notes as well. And again, Walter Gaynor II, I really appreciate it's been a pleasure talking with you. And I'm glad that we were able to connect, via Podfest and see what grew out of that. So that's
Oh yes.
yeah,
Yeah, and thank you for extending the invitation. I absolutely love this. From the very first 3 seconds, I was like hooked on your
the
podcast.
first 3 seconds.
Um,
I love it.
oh, the first 3 seconds, yeah. So I just love what you do, and I like for real, am honored to be a guest on your show. So thank you very much for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you so much, Walter. And I hope you have a wonderful afternoon playing with the daisies in the grass at the park. Or whatever you need to do today to replenish your soul. And we'll look forward to more wonderful episodes and the work that you're doing. And I just, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, I'll make a nice flower crown and I'll share it with you.
Yeah, that's got to be your next social media post. You know that.
It does. No caption. It's just like, if you know, you know. Check out Cheryl's podcast,
That's it.
19
That's
Stories.
it. Hey, sometimes that's the most powerful thing. Just post the photo. Don't say a thing about it. Be interesting to see how much inquiries you get into what is up with that. So
I'm gonna test it out. It's gonna be a sloppy flower crown, but so
that's
I'll
okay.
test it out.
That's okay. At least you'll be wearing your crown, right?
That's right. Ooh.
Thank you again, and you have a wonderful day. And thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, and you too, Cheryl.
I'd also like to thank the following news outlets for the use of their clips in so aptly painting the picture of the fear that we're facing during this pandemic: BBC, PBS, Now This, UNESCO, and Some Good News. I especially want to thank Joel and Luke Smallbone, otherwise known as the Group for King and Country, for allowing me to use an excerpt of their song Together, which could not be a more hopeful and inspiring song for such a time as this. Finally, I'll leave you with the following from Proverbs 23:18. Surely there is a future, and your hope will not be cut off. Thank you again for joining me today. Feel free to offer feedback or a story idea at 19stories@soundsatchelstudios.com. Visit my website at soundsatchelstudios.com, via Instagram at Cheryl Halling VO. I look forward to sharing more stories on the next episode of 19 Stories from Fear to Hope. Until then, stay healthy and hopeful.
Together with our differences, together we are bolder, braver, stronger.